Hey guys, tonight we start by slipping quietly into a cavernous medieval cathedral. The air is cool, and the first thing you notice is how it smells. Stone dust, old wood, candle smoke that's soaked into the mortar for centuries. You tilt your head back, and the ceiling just keeps going. Ribbed arches clawing at the heavens. Your voice, even if you whisper, seems to fly away from you, bouncing off the walls. And here's the reality check. If you were actually dropped into this space in the Middle Ages, you'd probably be too busy worrying about the Black Death, famine, or whether the local lord was about to tax you into the ground to actually admire the acoustics. Still, lucky for us, you don't have to survive this. You just get to float through the echoes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me your location and the time of night where you're tuning in. I love seeing how far these sleepy journeys travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You push open an enormous wooden door. It moans like an old man with bad knees. And then you're inside. The hush is immediate, thick, and you feel as though you've stepped into a place where sound doesn't behave like it does outside. One clap of your hands, and it's stretched, softened, multiplied, like the stone itself is singing back at you. That's the magic trick of these medieval cathedrals. They weren't just houses of God. They were sound machines. Picture a dozen monks standing near the altar, each wrapped in a woolen habit that probably itched like crazy. They begin a chant, simple, one-note melody. At first, you think it's plain, almost dull. But then, the building itself grabs hold of the sound, carries it, bends it, sends it swimming around you. Suddenly, the music isn't just voices. It's an atmosphere, a tide you're floating in. If you're not careful, you might just doze off and forget that you're supposed to be praying. Here's your first mainstream fact. Medieval cathedrals were designed with acoustics in mind, not like a modern concert hall with precise measurements and engineers in hard hats, but intuitively. Stone vaults, high ceilings, long aisles, all of it made sound linger, echo, and amplify. A single voice could feel like a choir. And when you've got people who believe music is literally a channel to the divine, well, that echo becomes part of the theology. Now, the quirky tidbit. Medieval people believed sound itself had physical effects. There's a record of folks worrying that chants sung incorrectly could actually harm the body or soul. Imagine catching a cold because Brother Thomas botched a high note. Not ideal. And because historians can't resist a good squabble. Here's your first debate. Scholars still argue whether cathedral acoustics shaped chant, or whether chant shaped the cathedrals. Did architects build to enhance the existing style of music? Or did the music evolve because someone noticed, hey, it sounds way cooler when we hold the note longer in here. Chicken, meat egg. You wander deeper. Sunlight filters through stained glass, scattering red and blue across the floor like spilled jewels. The glass doesn't just decorate, it filters the world, makes even daylight seem holy. And under that light, the chant continues, growing, falling, weaving patterns you don't need to understand to feel. Time works differently here. The chant has no hurry, no verse-chorus-verse like your Spotify playlist. It just unfurls like smoke from incense curling into the rafters. You lose track of minutes, even of yourself, which honestly is the point. The goal wasn't to entertain, it was to dissolve you into the divine. Still, if you squint, you can spot a few peasants in the back pews, trying very hard not to nod off. Let's be real, a 2-hour mass in a cold stone building could test anyone's patience. You'd probably sneak in a nap too, though good luck explaining that to Father Bernard. The chanting doesn't stop. It rolls like a tide, rising and falling with a rhythm older than the clocks. You shuffle forward on the cold flagstone floor, your footsteps swallowed by the sound. It's not a performance in the modern sense. Nobody's selling tickets. No one claps afterward. These are voices of devotion, pouring upward with every breath, each syllable aimed at heaven. The monks stand in 2 parallel rows, facing each other across the choir stalls. They sway slightly as they sing, eyes lowered to the leather-bound manuscripts, resting on tall wooden stands. And yes, if you're wondering, those manuscripts weren't cheap. Parchment made from calfskin, painstakingly scraped and prepared, ink mixed from oak galls and soot, and then every note, every squiggly mark, carefully brushed on by a scribe who probably muttered, "Why didn't I become a baker instead?" at least once per day. Here's the mainstream fact. Gregorian chant, the hallmark of medieval sacred music, became standardized under the watch of the Church. Named after Pope Gregory I, though historians still argue whether he personally hummed a few tunes or whether later generations just slapped his name on the project. The chant gave Europe a common musical language. The effect of it? A monk in France could open a book and sing the same melody as a monk in Italy. That sense of unity, of collective devotion, mattered in a fragmented world. The voices echoing through cloisters and cathedrals alike, stitched together an entire continent with sound. And yet, it wasn't as rigid as you might think. Chant could bend, drift, ornament itself. Sometimes the cantor, basically the soloist, would linger on a note, like a cat refusing to move off your keyboard. Other times, a whole phrase would seem to hover, circling the rafters before returning to earth. These were not just prayers. They were performances of faith. Now for the quirky tidbit, some monks actually believed that singing chant could chase away demons. Picture Brother Stephen waking up in the night after too much cheese, muttering a quick Kyrie Ellison, not just for God's mercy, but because he swore he heard scratching in the dark. Supernatural pest control, medieval style. You lean against one of the great pillars and close your eyes. The Latin flows around you. Do you understand the words? Probably not. Even many peasants of the age didn't. Latin wasn't their language, but the sound, slow, solemn, repeating, carried its own meaning. It didn't matter if you caught every syllable. You felt it. Historians still argue whether chant was more about the words or about the sound itself. Was the message in the meaning of the text, or in the hypnotic repetition that lulled you into a sacred trance? Either way, you can imagine the ordinary villager, weary from fields and famine, slipping into the church and suddenly being lifted by voices so steady, so otherworldly, that for a few moments, the weight of life lightened. And don't forget the daily grind. The monks didn't just sing on Sundays. Their entire day was structured around the divine office. 8 services scattered across the hours, from matins in the dead of night to vespers at twilight. The chants were like clock chimes before clocks existed. You always knew what time it was in the monastery. Just follow the voices. You watch them continue. The cantor gestures with a hand, and the group responds. It's not flashy, not operatic, but it is unwavering. The devotion is baked into the act. Imagine the discipline. Years of training your voice, not for applause, but for prayer. And somewhere in the rafters, a pigeon coos, entirely unimpressed by the centuries of musical tradition unfolding below. Even in sacred spaces, life always sneaks in. The chant fades, drifting in the silence so complete, you can hear the scrape of sandals on stone. One monk closes a manuscript with a soft thump, and you realize that the entire ritual rests on something you almost take for granted. Musical notation. Without ink and line, memory alone carried the song. Imagine trying to hold hundreds of melodies in your head without Spotify, without playlists, without even a post-it note. You'd probably forget half of them by lunch. Here's the mainstream fact. Around the 9th century, numes, the first squiggly notational marks, began appearing in manuscripts. They weren't notes as we know them today, just directional nudges. A little curve meant go up. A slant meant drop down. It was more like GPS instructions than a full road map. Turn left at the oak tree, keep singing higher. And yet, for monks who already knew the melodies by heart, these numes acted like memory anchors. They let music survive beyond a single voice, beyond a single monastery. Slowly, Europe was sketching out its first shared sheet music. The quirky tidbit. Some early scribes doodled tiny faces into their notations. Grim little caricatures, squished between the lines, maybe to amuse themselves during endless copying sessions. You're staring at the birth of written music, and someone's basically adding medieval emojis in the margins. You lean closer to one of these manuscripts. The calfskin pages still faintly textured with pores. The ink has browned with age, but the numes are clear. Little ticks, dots, squiggles, hovering above the Latin text. They float there like secret code. Without training, you can't sing them. But to a monk of the time, they were lifelines. Historians still argue whether these early numes were ever meant to be sight-read by someone who didn't already know the tune. Some say they were purely mnemonic, a cheat sheet for the memory. Others believe they were the seed of a more universal system, a way to pass music across generations without the oral chain breaking. Picture the daily reality. Brother Martin, the cantor, trains the novices. Sing after me, he says, voice steady, and they try to follow. But if their voices wander, he points to the page. See? Up here, stay higher. The written squiggle becomes both reminder and ruler. And then, sometime in the 11th century, a game changer, Guido of Arezzo. He's the medieval equivalent of that one teacher who finally invents a color-coded chart that saves the class. Guido introduced staff lines, 4 horizontal rules that locked the squiggles into actual pitches. No more guessing, higher or lower. For the first time, you could capture an exact note. You hear the choir test it out. They line their voices to the page, eyes flicking from line to line. And suddenly the chant has a precision it never had before. A monk in Spain could, in theory, read the same book and sing the same melody as one in Germany without ever having met. That's music going viral in the Middle Ages, just without TikTok. The cathedral around you hums with the memory of these experiments. You can almost feel the frustration of a novice monk squinting at the page, muttering, "Is that dot on the line or just above it? Am I flat or sharp?" The struggle is timeless. Musicians still argue with their sheet music today. And yet, think of the revolution. Sound, once ephemeral as breath, captured, frozen, and handed down. Without those squiggles, Mozart never happens. Beethoven never happens. Your favorite pop playlist never happens. It all begins here, with monks scratching lines onto animal skin, trying to keep their songs from slipping away. You glance up again at the stained glass, where colored light pours across the music stand. The pages glow, and for a moment, you realize you're looking at the first breath of notation itself. Music becoming memory, becoming history. The cathedral doors swing shut behind you, and the thunder of space gives way to something more intimate. The cloister. Here the walls close in, arcades curve around a quiet garden, and the soundscape changes completely. Gone are the vast echoes of soaring stone vaults. Instead, every footstep, every cough, every half-whisper rings clearly against carved columns. You step onto the worn flagstones, and the sound of your sandals scrapes like a drum roll, announcing your presence. The cloister isn't just an architectural feature, it's the heartbeat of monastic life. Think of it as a medieval campus squad, but instead of frisbees and iced lattes, you've got solemn monks pacing with prayer books. Every hour here is measured not by clocks, but by bells and voices. The divine office divides the day into sacred slices, and you, lucky stowaway, get to trail behind as the hours unfold. Here's the mainstream fact. The rule of Saint Benedict, written way back in the 6th century, structured monastic life around ora et labora, prayer and work. Music, in the form of chant, was the scaffolding of prayer. From the dark hush of matins before dawn to the final compline prayers at night, the cloister breathed music as steadily as lungs breathe air. The quirky tidbit: some monasteries were so committed to perfect pitch that they trained young boys with pitch pipes or monochords. Basically, medieval monks invented the first ear training apps, minus the phone, and plus a lot of scolding. One story tells of a novice who couldn't hit the right note, so the cantor threatened him with extra fasting. Imagine being hangry and off-key. Rough deal. You wander with the procession. The bell has just rung for terce. Mid-morning prayer. The monks file into the choir, their chants rising in soft waves. It's not a concert, it's a rhythm of existence. The cloister itself amplifies the sound differently than the cathedral. Sharper, more immediate. The voices don't drift forever. They cut, they repeat. They come back at you like echoes in a well. Historians still argue whether the daily cycle of chant was soothing or suffocating. Did it provide comfort, anchoring each day in divine order? Or did it smother individuality, binding every breath to ritual. You listen, and the answer feels slippery. It depends on the ear, the mood, maybe even the weather. At midday, you hear the clang of pots from the refectory. Even meals are sung. Monks chant grace before eating, the Latin syllables weaving into the smell of stew and bread. No chatting over lunch, no medieval gossip about who left their sandals out of place. Silence reigns, except for the reader. One monk reciting scripture aloud, while the others chewing quietly. Mind you, because who wants to be the guy crunching loudly while Brother John reads Revelation? After lunch, you stroll back into the cloister walk. Sunlight cuts through the arcade, warming the garden in the center. Bees buzz lazily, indifferent to centuries of sacred routine. Somewhere, a monk hums a fragment of chant while sweeping. Work and prayer blur until they're almost the same thing, both offering up rhythm, both creating a soundscape that turns ordinary tasks into devotion. And then, as twilight falls, the bell tolls again. Vespers. The air cools, shadows stretch, and the chant takes on a darker hue. It's slower now, more contemplative, like the day itself is bowing out. When the final syllables fade, the cloister falls silent. So silent, you can hear your own breathing bounce off the stone. You realize that here, sound isn't just heard. It's the architecture of time itself. Without it, the day would dissolve into formless hours. With it, life becomes a chant, steady, repetitive, holy. And you, drifting in the cloister shadows, can feel how the echoes don't just live in the stone. They live in the people who carry them every day, without end. The cloister fades behind you, its measured rhythm of bells and whispered prayer replaced by something louder, glittering, and unapologetically proud. You emerge into a royal hall, where the ceilings are just as high as the cathedrals, but dressed in banners instead of stained glass. The air smells not of incense, but of roasted meats and wine gone slightly sour. And here, the music is no longer just about God. It's about kings. A herald's trumpet blares, wobbling slightly, because, let's be honest, medieval brass instruments weren't exactly precision engineered. The sound ricochets off stone walls, and then the choir enters, robes embroidered with golden thread, voices sharp and shimmering. These aren't monks singing humble devotion. This is music as spectacle, music as political weapon. Here's the mainstream fact. Medieval kings and princes kept chapels, private choirs of trained singers who traveled with the court. They weren't just there to sweeten dinner. They were status symbols. To hear a lush, polyphonic choir under your roof was to prove you had wealth, piety, and cultural clout. Think of it like showing off your Spotify playlist. Except your playlist consists of 20 human beings singing in harmony at your command. The quirky tidbit. Some royal patrons got so into their music that they personally joined in. King Henry V of England was said to enjoy singing plain chant with his chapel choir. Imagine walking into the great hall and finding the king himself, trying to keep on pitch while glaring at anyone who dared outshine him. Not exactly an easy gig for the tenor next to him. Historians still argue whether these royal choirs shaped the music of the church, or whether they simply borrowed it and polished it for show. Was the court chapel the testing ground for new musical complexity, or was it merely a glamorous echo of what the monasteries were already perfecting. You sit among the crowd as the choir begins. This isn't a single-line chant of the cloister. No, this is polyphony, voices stacked and twined. One voice holds a steady drone, another dances above it, a third weaves in like a bright thread. It's messy, it's dazzling, it's alive. The king leans back, goblet in hand, and you can almost hear him thinking. Yes, this will impress the French envoy. The sound is richer because it's meant for a different audience. Nobles lean forward, whispering to each other, impressed, unlike the peasants slipping into church for a moment of comfort. These listeners are alert to sophistication. Music here is politics in disguise. Every note reminding you who's in charge, who has the money to pay for silk, feasts, and a choir that won't hit the wrong note. Between sets, jesters and minstrels take their turn, fiddling and juggling to break the solemnity. You catch the smell of wax dripping from chandeliers, the shimmer of jewels as courtiers laugh too loudly at jokes that aren't funny. And then the choir begins again, this time with something slower, reverent. A reminder that kings claim authority from heaven itself. You lean against a pillar, watching how everyone reacts. Some wipe away tears at the beauty. Others roll their eyes, clearly just waiting for dessert. And somewhere near the throne, a scribe takes notes, because later, this music might be written down, polished, and sent as a gift to another court. A song could travel farther than armies, carrying prestige on parchment. Outside, the wind howls, peasants shuffle through muddy streets, and hunger gnaws at villages. But in here, the music is silk. Voices float above reality, wrapping the king in a cocoon of sound that says, "You are chosen, you are powerful, you are eternal." And as the final chord echoes into silence, you can almost believe it yourself. The royal hall fades into torchlight, and suddenly you're outside on a rutted dirt road. The soundscape shifts again. No lofty echo of cathedrals, no polished choir draped in velvet. Here, the music comes from dust, leather sandals, and the steady pluck of a lute, strapped to the back of a rider. You've landed among the troubadours, those wandering poets of the Middle Ages who carried songs the way merchants carried spices. The road winds through fields, vineyards, and villages. You hear hooves on stone bridges, wheels creaking, dogs barking at strangers. And then, in a small market square, a troubadour stops. He pulls out his lute, or maybe a vielle, basically a medieval fiddle. And with the confidence of someone who knows he's the main entertainment for miles around, he begins to sing. Here's the mainstream fact. Troubadours flourished in the 12th and 13th centuries, especially in southern France. They wrote and performed lyric poetry, fin amour, refined love, the origin of our modern idea of courtly love. Knights and ladies swooned to their tales of unattainable devotion, noble suffering, and secret longing. Without them, your rom-com playlist would look very different. The quirky tidbit: some troubadours weren't men at all. They were trobairettes, female poet-singers who performed with just as much daring. They flipped the script, voicing the perspective of women yearning or criticizing men who failed to live up to ideals. Picture Lady Beatriz de Dia belting a verse about her lover's shortcomings, while the crowd lends in, smirking at the scandal. Medieval shade at its finest. Historians still argue whether troubadours were respected artists or just glorified street performers. Some courts showered them with patronage and invited them to sing at feasts. Others treated them like wandering buskers, paid in bread, beer, and maybe a bed of straw if they were lucky. The truth probably sits somewhere in between, sometimes revered, sometimes ignored, always on the move. You watch as the crowd gathers, children press close, peasants grin, and a merchant tosses a coin into a battered cap. The troubadour's voice rises above the chatter, weaving tales of lovers separated by rivers, by wars, by duty. His fingers dance across the strings, not always in tune, but alive. This isn't about perfection, it's about connection. He sings of nights, riding into danger for the glance of a lady, of secret trysts behind cloister walls, of heartbreak so intense you'd think medieval villagers had invented emo centuries early. And yet, the melodies are light, nimble, easy to hum. By evening, you'll catch yourself repeating a refrain you don't even fully understand. Night falls, and a fire crackles. Troubadours often travel together or join pilgrims for safety. Around the flames, the songs change. Out come bawdier verses, jokes at the expense of clergy or nobles, tunes better suited to wine than worship. Here, music isn't devotion or prestige. It's survival, laughter, and a way to turn cold nights into community. The road itself becomes a carrier of culture. A song born in Aquitaine might wander north into England or east into Italy. Melodies hitchhike with travelers, mutate with accents, and before long, everyone claims them as their own. It's like medieval remix culture, except the copyright office is, let's just say, non-existent. As you drift off by the firelight, the last verse hangs in the air, a promise of longing, of beauty carried on tired feet, of stories too important to stay silent. The troubadour slings his lute over his shoulder, ready for tomorrow's road, tomorrow's crowd, tomorrow's coin. And you, still humming under your breath, realize that in these dusty songs of love and scandal, Europe found not just music, but itself. The firelight of the troubadours fades, and now you're stepping through a quieter gate, one that creaks just enough to remind you this place doesn't welcome wanderers lightly. You've entered the world behind convent walls, where the voices you hear are not of wandering men with dusty boots, but women cloaked in veils, their song rising not for coins or courtly applause, but for something both more private and more radical. At first glance, the cloistered convent looks like its male counterpart. Stone walls, a central garden, the steady toll of bells. But listen closely, the sound is different. Higher voices, weaving in harmonies that seem more fragile, yet somehow more daring. These are the women behind the veil, nuns, mystics, and composers who bent the rules of their time, even while obeying the rituals of devotion. Here's the mainstream fact. One of the most famous of these women was Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, visionary, and composer. She didn't just write music. She wrote music that stretched beyond the usual bounds of chant. Wide vocal leaps, soaring melismas, daring ranges that made her pieces stand apart. In her convent, women sang with a fire that echoed her visions of divine light. And here's your quirky tidbit. Hildegard also invented her own language, the lingua ignota, a mystical tongue of invented words she claimed was revealed to her. Imagine writing lyrics in your own made-up vocabulary and convincing everyone it was divinely inspired. She basically created the medieval version of Elvish, except Tolkien wasn't around yet to nerd out over it. Historians still argue whether women's musical contributions were encouraged as genuine expressions of spirituality or tolerated only because they were tucked safely away in convent walls. Did abbesses like Hildegard thrive because their visions were respected, or because they cleverly framed their creativity as divine command? Rather than personal ambition, you wander into a dim chapel where candles gutter in iron holders. The air tastes of beeswax and stone dust. The choir of nuns begins a responsory, and it feels both delicate and unstoppable. Their voices blend in a way that doesn't sound like the rigid, rule-bound chants of male monasteries. Instead, they swoop, they rise, they spill over the staff lines, as if refusing to be contained. Picture the daily life here: prayers at dawn, weaving cloth, copying manuscripts, tending gardens, caring for the sick, and always music. For many nuns, song was the brightest thread in an otherwise regimented existence. And through that thread, they could reach beyond the walls, touching something infinite. But the music wasn't always solemn. Some convents were notorious for their creativity, even irreverence. In a few cases, bishops scolded communities of nuns for singing songs too joyously, for indulging in melodies that made worship feel a little too much like fun. Imagine getting a church memo: "Sisters, please dial back the enthusiasm. The joy of the Lord is fine, but not that fine." The debate about women's voices doesn't stop at music. In some places, convents became hubs of culture, with women writing not only songs, but poetry, plays, and even theology. Yet outside those walls, their names often vanished, erased by time or dismissed as minor. You pause, listening to the way the music lingers in the rafters, and it feels like resistance in harmony. Soft, yet undeniable, a breeze slips through the chapel, flickering the flames. The sisters' chant swells, filling every corner. For a moment, you're sure Hildegard's visions were right. The music feels less like sound and more like light spilling through you, dissolving the veil not just on their heads, but between earth and heaven. And you realize, behind the veil, the voices of women weren't just echoing. They were reshaping the very sound of the Middle Ages. The convent fades, the nuns' luminous voices drifting away, and you find yourself standing at the base of a half-built cathedral. Dust coats your sandals, and the air is filled with the clatter of tools. The soundscape is nothing like the hushed cloister or polished court. It's chaos, alive with hammer blows, shouted orders, and the deep groan of ropes pulling stone skyward. This is music too, though no one calls it that. The music of construction. The cathedral rises in fragments around you, walls jutting upward like cliffs, scaffolding clinging precariously to the stone. Masons chip at limestone blocks, chisels striking with a rhythm that feels accidental at first, until you realize it's steady. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, pause. The thump of mallets joins in. The grind of cartwheels over cobblestones adds a bass line. And somewhere, A boy whistles, just to pass the time. If you close your eyes, the sight becomes an orchestra, and the symphony is centuries long. Here's the mainstream fact. Cathedrals like Chartres, Reims, and Cologne often took more than 100 years to build. Generations were born and died under the shadow of cranes and scaffolds. The people who laid the foundation and never lived to see the vaults finished. And yet, the sound of construction became as much a part of medieval life as the ringing of the church bells themselves. The quirky tidbit: some cathedrals employed designated stone singers, workers whose job was to strike stones with mallets and listen for the pitch. A ringing, clear tone meant the stone was sound. A dull thud meant weakness. They literally tested rock like tuning forks. Imagine job training. Congratulations, you're the cathedral's official rock listener. Historians still argue whether music influenced the way cathedrals were built, or if the acoustics were happy accidents. Did masons deliberately carve vaults to magnify chant? Or did the monks later adapt their music to whatever echoes the stone happened to give them? That old chicken or egg debate keeps circling through the scaffolds, like the doves that roost above you. You wander closer. A mason wipes sweat from his brow, strikes another block, and the sound rings high and sharp. Nearby, a group of apprentices saw timbers for scaffolding, the saws squealing in uneven duets. A cart creaks past, oxen snorting, and the driver hums under his breath. The work is dangerous, grueling, but the soundtrack is unrelenting. At noon, a bell clangs from the temporary wooden tower, and everyone drops tools. Out come loaves of coarse bread, onions, and a skin of ale passed around. Workers sit on beams and stone piles, and inevitably, someone pulls out a bagpipe or a rebec. The break turns into a quick burst of music. Rough, cheerful, earthy. For a few minutes, the cathedral in progress isn't just a construction site, but a village dance floor. Then, back to work. Ropes strain, pulleys squeal, and stone rises slowly, block by block. You crane your neck to watch as a block slides into place, the thud echoing through your chest when it lands. The sound is final, permanent, another note added to a composition no single ear will hear complete. And above it all, you can almost sense the future music waiting. Choirs that will someday stand in these vaults, their voices magnified by the very walls being chipped and hauled around you now. It's strange to realize that the laborers, sweating and cursing below, are building the world's greatest instrument without ever knowing what it will sound like. As the sun sets, the scaffolds cast long shadows, and the hammers quiet one by one. A final cart rattles away, leaving the unfinished cathedral looming like a skeleton against the evening sky. The silence afterward is startling. For hours, your ears have been ringing with chisels and bells, and now the absence of sound is almost louder than the noise. You stand there, gazing upward. The unfinished arches frame the stars, and you realize the construction itself is a kind of chant, measured, repetitive, unhurried. And though the workers will die long before the cathedral is finished, their rhythm will remain, etched into the walls, waiting to echo with music that outlasts them all. The cathedral fades behind you, its scaffolds and cranes dissolving into mist. And now you find yourself on a dirt road, winding through rolling fields. Dust clings to your clothes, your sandals ache, and your stomach growls from too much bread and too little meat. You're not alone, never alone. The road is thick with travelers, men and women with walking sticks, packs slung over shoulders, children tugging along goats, even the occasional knight whose armor squeaks at every step. You've fallen in with pilgrims, the great movers of medieval sound. The air is alive with voices. Pilgrims sing to keep their feet in rhythm, to keep spirits from sagging on endless marches. The songs are simple, catchy, and repetitive, easy to pick up, even if you've only just joined. Someone up front belts out the first line, and the crowd answers in a ragged chorus. It's not polished like the choirs of kings, not solemn like cloister chant, but it has energy. This is road music, designed to be shouted over the creak of wagons and the bark of dogs. Here's the mainstream fact. Pilgrimage was one of the defining cultural movements of the Middle Ages. Routes like the Camino de Santiago in Spain or the Via Francigena leading to Rome carried not just the faithful, but also their songs, stories, and melodies. By the time a pilgrim reached the shrine, they might have heard dozens of regional styles, absorbing and trading tunes the way modern travelers swap playlists. Pilgrimage routes were highways of sound, spreading music across Europe long before sheet notation could. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some pilgrim songs doubled as practical travel hacks. One French tune literally counted the miles between towns, like a medieval Google Maps with a melody. Imagine hundreds of tired travelers trudging along, chanting, 3 miles to the river, 5 miles to the inn, turning navigation into karaoke. Historians debate whether these songs were grassroots creations by the pilgrims themselves, or if clergy seeded them to keep the devotion on track. Were they folk expressions bubbling from the road, or carefully managed tools of control? Either way, the songs worked, and they lingered in manuscripts that now give us glimpses of that dusty, noisy journeying world. The march continues. You pass a tabor drum tapping out a beat, its owner proudly leading a small cluster of children who sing louder than anyone else. Somewhere, a hurdy-gurdy wheezes, its crank turned by a farmer with more enthusiasm than skill. The squeal of the strings doesn't matter. What matters is the energy. The music keeps feet moving and spirits lifted, and even the surliest knight mutters along when the chorus repeats for the 10th time. At nightfall, the group camps outside a wayside chapel. Fires spark, pots bubble, and voices don't stop. They simply change key. The mood is looser now, playful. Ballads of saints mixed with bawdy songs about innkeepers, and laughter carries across the camp. Pilgrimage wasn't just prayer and piety. It was also social, rowdy, human. Music blurred those lines beautifully. As you lie back on your cloak, the stars overhead, the music shifts once more. A small cluster of pilgrims begins a slow, haunting hymn, their voices rising pure and soft into the night. It hushes the camp. Even the animals seem to listen. For a moment, the road-worn travelers become a choir. The dirt road, their cathedral. The stars, their vaulted ceiling. By morning, the feet are sore again, the dust thicker, and the road stretches endlessly forward. Yet the songs keep returning, like breath itself. Pilgrims' music, weaving Europe together, one dusty step at a time. The road is behind you now. Instead of mud and sore feet, you step into the wild, chaotic hum of a medieval town fair. The smells hit first: roasting meat, fresh bread, spilled ale, and just a hint of horse. Then come the sounds. Bells clang as stalls open. Merchants shout about miracle wares. Children shriek in delight as jugglers toss knives into the air. And treading through it all, louder than haggling or laughter, is music. Here, the feast and fair are their own kind of cathedral, not of stone and devotion, but of wood, canvas, and appetite. Music doesn't float solemnly up to heaven. It dances right into your stomach, into your tapping toes, into the mug of ale someone presses into your hand. A fiddler stands on a makeshift platform, bow scratching across strings as he launches into a tune so quick it dares your heart to keep pace. A drum joins in, thumping like footsteps across packed earth, while a bagpipe wheezes along, equal parts melody and mayhem. You look around, and the crowd is moving, spinning, stomping, clapping. Farmers, bakers, monks on holiday, even a nobleman who's loosened his belt after too much goose, all thrown together in a whirl of sound. Here's the mainstream fact. Fairs and feasts were not just commercial gatherings, but hubs of cultural exchange. Musicians traveled with the merchants, their repertoires stuffed with tunes from other towns and regions. A single afternoon's entertainment could blend French estampes, English carols, and German drinking songs, cross-pollination at full volume. What the cathedral notated in careful ink, the marketplace spread in shouts, claps, and dances. Now for a quirky detail. Some fiddlers at fairs were infamous for tweaking sacred melodies into dance tunes. Imagine a solemn hymn reworked with a thumping drum so you could jig to it while gnawing on a chicken leg. The clergy sometimes scolded this as blasphemy, but the crowd cheered louder. Who could resist a holy tune with a sinful beat? And here's the historians' debate. Were these fairs places where low, popular music thrived beneath the gaze of the church? Or were they part of the same cultural ecosystem, different branches of the same tree? Some argue the fairs safeguarded the raw, improvisational side of medieval sound, while others suggest the clergy and nobility actually absorbed plenty of it into their own repertoires. After all, even kings hired fiddlers when the banquet tables were cleared. The fair keeps rolling. Acrobats tumble, cymbals crash. A bear dances awkwardly on its hind legs, while a piper plays a shrill march. In one corner, a blind hurdy-gurdy player sings a ballad of knights and lost love, while passers-by toss coins into his cap. Just steps away, a group of drunk farmers belt out a roundabout ale, their harmonies accidental but strangely effective. As dusk falls, torches light up the square, and the music only grows faster. Dancers kick up dust, skirts fly, mugs slam against tables in rhythm with the fiddler's bow. It's messy, it's sweaty, it's gloriously alive. If cathedral chant was meant to carry souls to heaven, fairground music was meant to remind you that heaven could feel very close, right here. Sticky fingers, aching legs, and all. And as you drift away from the square, head buzzing from noise and drink, you realize that these tunes will travel. Merchants, pilgrims, and minstrels will carry them down other roads, into other towns, across borders and languages. Tomorrow, some noble in a distant court might hum the same melody that a barefoot farmer just stamped out in the dust tonight. The feast ends. The fair closes. But the music won't. It's already moving. You wake to the clatter of wood, the rasp of metal files, and the faint, resinous scent of shavings. No cathedral this time. No smoky tavern. Just a cramped workshop tucked down an alley. Sunlight spills through a tiny window, catching dust motes that dance like notes in the air. Here, the music doesn't come from throats or bells. It's born from raw matter: wood, gut, brass, bone. Instruments are taking shape. The craftsman before you is hunched, sleeves rolled, sweat dripping onto the bench. In one hand, he steadies a block of maple. In the other, a small chisel. Tap, shave, smooth, repeat. Each sound, the scrape of the knife, the tap of a mallet, is part of a slow symphony of creation. A fiddle's curved ribs curl upward from a mold, like the unfurling petals of a flower. Strings made of twisted sheep gut dry on a rack. A drumhead, stretched taut across a wooden frame, smells faintly of leather and lime. A brass worker next door hammers away at a sheet of metal, coaxing it into a bell that will one day blare above a marketplace crowd. This is where the tools of music itself were refined. Before, voices had done most of the work. But as medieval society spun with more fairs, more feasts, more ceremony, the appetite for sound grew. Instruments weren't just playthings anymore. They became essential. Here's the mainstream fact. During the High Middle Ages, the shapes of many instruments we recognize today, fiddles, lutes, bagpipes, early flutes, harps, took on forms that would eventually stabilize into the families we still play. No longer crude improvisations. These were carefully designed, honed by craft guilds, and tailored for specific settings. Lute for the chamber, pipe and tabor for the street, organ for the cathedral. A quirky detail? Some fiddlers and pipers were notorious for modifying their instruments in outlandish ways. There are reports of bagpipes with extra pipes stuck in for sheer loudness, or fiddles cobbled together with animal horn bridges to create screeching, devilishly sharp tones. And one manuscript even depicts a bizarre hybrid, half harp, half hurdy-gurdy, that might have been more of a joke than a playable object. Medieval musicians were not above tinkering for chaos. And the scholarly debate: were these instruments standardized across Europe, or were they highly local, each village producing its own eccentric variation? Some argue that manuscripts and surviving fragments point to wide consistency. Fiddles look like fiddles from England to Italy. Others point out the sheer inventiveness of medieval artisans, suggesting that every craftsman left a personal stamp, meaning two lutes might share only a passing resemblance. The truth may be somewhere in between. Regional flavors inside an emerging, interconnected sound world. You pick up a nearly finished lute. The body is smooth, pear-shaped, polished, like amber. Its delicate rosette is cut in a pattern, so fine it looks spun from lace. Run your finger over the strings. They hum, raw and uneven. The maker nods, satisfied. One day, this instrument will accompany a troubadour, singing in a noble's hall, or soothe a lady's boredom in her chamber. For now, it's just a shell, a promise. Behind you, Another craftsman pumps at a small set of organ bellows. The pipes wheeze and cough, filling the room with a breathy, half-formed chord. Someone else tries out a recorder, the notes bright and piercing. It's a cacophony, but also a nursery, the sound world of the Middle Ages, being born not just in monasteries or fairs, but here, in sweat, splinters, and stubborn hands. By evening, the workshop closes. The shavings are swept aside, instruments tucked away like sleeping children. But tomorrow, the same process will begin again. Wood to sound, silence to music. And slowly, through countless anonymous hands, the orchestra of the medieval world takes shape. Because before there was a song to play, there had to be something to play it on. The first thing you notice is the pause, a breath in the soundscape, as if the world has stopped to listen for something new. You're back inside a stone hall. This time, not a workshop, not a cloister, but a gathering place. A long wooden table stretches before you. Ink-stained manuscripts scattered across it like half-baked puzzles. A monk hums a line under his breath. Then another joins in, tentatively, testing how one note rests against another. What you are witnessing is the birth of harmony. Before now, medieval music had been largely a single strand. Chant, unison, one voice following another, like footsteps on the same narrow path. But here, someone has stepped off that road. At first, it's simple. One singer takes the melody, another doubles at a fixed interval, say, a fourth or a fifth above. It's raw, a little strange, but undeniably fuller, richer, like sunlight refracting into two beams instead of one. They call it organum. You hear the word murmured as notes are scratched into the page. The experiment spreads. Soon, voices cross and bend, weaving together like colored threads in a tapestry. The effect is startling. Instead of a single note piercing the air, you're wrapped in sound. Music isn't just a line anymore. It's a space. Mainstream fact. The 12th century witnessed the rise of polyphony, most famously at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. Composers like Léonin and Perrotin, names we actually know, which was rare, took chant melodies and layered voices above and below them, creating the first great flowering of Western harmony. Perrotin's Viderunt omnes, with four voices interlacing like cathedral arches, was considered mind-blowing in its day. Some thought too excessive, even dangerous. Quirky detail. In some early polyphonic pieces, singers reportedly struggled to stay in tune so badly that commentators joked it sounded like two goats bleeding together. Others claimed it gave listeners headaches or caused an odd dizziness, as if one's ears weren't prepared for so much sonic density. The wow factor sometimes slipped into the "what is that?" zone. Scholarly debate. Did this innovation come as a natural outgrowth of liturgical practice? Monks bored with endless plainchant finding ways to spice it up? Or was it sparked by cross-cultural exchange? Perhaps with Byzantine or even Islamic traditions that explored complex tonal relationships earlier. Some argue Paris was simply inevitable as a hub of learning. Others wonder whether pilgrims and crusaders brought back more than just relics. But theory aside, you feel it. You sit in the middle of the hall as four young clerics raise their voices. At first, the sound clashes, like colors that shouldn't belong together. But then it settles. The harmony locks. The stone walls hum in sympathy, as though they too were waiting for this discovery. It's not just more beautiful, it changes how time itself feels. A single line of chant pulls you forward, step after step. Polyphony, though, it holds you in a shimmering web, suspending you between tones, making you linger. This is music, learning to breathe in more than one dimension. Later, as dusk settles, you step outside. Through an open church door, you hear the new style drifting over the street. Familiar chant, yes, but now colored, transformed, radiant. 2, 3, 4 voices stacked like towers of sound. The city itself seems to lean in, as though harmony were an invisible scaffolding propping up its tones. Harmony is no longer an accident. It's deliberate, structured, practiced. And from here, music will never be the same. You find yourself standing at the edge of the Ile de la Cité, Paris, the Seine, curling around the stone island like an arm in embrace. The year is the late 12th century, and above you rises something staggering the skeletal frame of a cathedral, so ambitious it seems to claw at heaven itself. Notre Dame isn't yet finished. It won't be for decades. But already, it's the most daring construction you've ever seen. Flying buttresses stretch like wings. Scaffolding creaks with human effort. And bells toll across the water in uneven rhythms. And inside, behind the chisel dust and the echo of hammer strikes, experiments are unfolding that will forever reshape music. You enter the nave, where sunlight sneaks through half-installed stained glass, spraying jewels of color across the unfinished stone floor. A group of clerics gather not at the altar, but around a tall, narrow lectern bearing a massive choir book. The pages are thick, lines drawn in red, black squares carefully inked upon them. These aren't just chants. These are daring blueprints. Here, at Notre Dame, music has become a laboratory. Mainstream fact. In the 12th and 13th centuries, Notre Dame was home to the first identifiable school of composers. Chief among them were Léonin, master of the Magnus Liber Organi, a great book of polyphony, and Perrotin, who expanded Léonin's work by adding more voices, rhythmic patterns, and architectural grandeur in sound. Perrotin's famous 4-voice setting of Viderunt Omnes was like laying an acoustic cathedral atop the stone one. Some scholars suggest these pieces were performed during Christmas masses, filling the half-finished church with music so complex it rivaled the vaulting overhead. Quirky detail. The system they developed to make these experiments possible was rhythm itself. Until now, chant notation told you what to sing, but not when. At Notre Dame, rhythmic modes were introduced. Patterns like long-short, short-long, trotting along in repeating sequences. It's a bit like inventing the traffic light. Suddenly singers could coordinate, avoid sonic collisions, and keep the polyphony from devolving into goat-like bleating. Yet by modern standards, the notation looked like cryptic puzzles. It required performers to memorize rhythmic modes, as if learning secret dance steps. Scholarly debate. Were these vast compositions actually sung in full during liturgy? Or were they more like demonstrations of theory? Polished gems rolled out only for special occasions. Some musicologists argue Perrotin's four-voice works would have been too elaborate for practical worship, too long, too overwhelming for an untrained congregation. Others counter that the grandeur was the point. If the cathedral itself was a miracle of stone, the music had to match, stretching human voices into sonic architecture. You slip closer to the singers as they begin. First comes the drone of a chant melody, low and steady, like the cathedral's foundation stones. Then another voice slides above, blooming in perfect fifths. A third enters, bouncing in rhythmic sequence. And then, shockingly, a fourth. The sound is dizzying. Notes tumble over each other like light shards through stained glass. At times, it feels like the music will collapse under its own weight. But then it steadies, rising and rising, lifting you with it. The scribes lean over the parchment, pointing, whispering. Each phrase is a test, a pushing of boundaries. What happens if we stretch this melisma to 100 notes? Can we layer rhythms that loop like gears in a clock? It is science, but also devotion. The singers close their eyes, lost in the latticework of sound, as if mapping invisible staircases, spiraling upward into the vault. From the street outside, a passerby hears something uncanny. Long, endless syllables drawn out, voices stacking in unnatural suspension. Some shake their heads, muttering about novelty or noise. But inside the cathedral, you know you are hearing the future being written, note by note. When the last chord settles, voices locking in a resonance that buzzes through the stone like thunder. The silence feels like standing in the wake of creation itself. Notre Dame is not only a building site for heaven's house, it is also the forge where harmony becomes cathedral-shaped, a monumental sound that will outlast the dust of its makers. The year is the early 13th century, and Europe hums with contradiction. You can hear it in the streets, in the cloisters, in the very air between church bells and tavern doors. One moment, a solemn procession winds through town, incense curling upward like smoke toward heaven. The next moment, a crowd gathers around a juggler, laughing as he balances on a barrel, while a fiddler saws out a tune so lively you can practically taste the ale. This is the soundscape of a society caught between two poles, the sacred and the profane. Step inside a church on Sunday morning, and the walls vibrate with plainchant or polyphony. Monks intone verses in Latin, their voices meant to rise above earthly distraction, aiming for purity, eternity, divine order. You close your eyes, and it feels as if time itself slows. The chant stretching every syllable into timeless space. The cathedral is meant to lift you up and out of the mud and mess of life. Now walk outside those same cathedral doors on a feast day. The town square is crammed with color. A puppet show ridicules local officials with wooden marionettes clacking their jaws. Minstrels sing bawdy ballads about cheating millers and lusty maidens. Drummers beat on stretched skins. Dancers kick up dust. What you hear now is no less music than the chant inside. Yet its purpose is utterly different. Instead of ascending toward God, it drags you joyfully into the dirt of human life. Mainstream fact: this tension between sacred and profane gave rise to a rich tradition of medieval secular music, often in vernacular languages rather than Latin. Troubadours in southern France sang of courtly love. Trouvères in the north composed songs that could be both refined and sly. In Germany, minnesingers spun tales of love, satire, and politics. Meanwhile, Goliards, wandering scholars, and clerics, gone rogue, penned biting verses mocking corruption in both church and society. Collections like the Carmina Burana preserve these irreverent texts, some of which were later set to music that still shocks with its cheekiness, quirky detail. One infamous Goliard song compares the human soul to roast goose. Yes, you heard that right. The singer imagines the goose cooked, carved, and consumed, a darkly comic allegory about mortality and pleasure. Another features a drinking song that lists the virtues of wine in a cascade of Latin puns. These were the medieval equivalent of rowdy college anthems, proof that even men in clerical robes sometimes snuck away from piety to party. Scholarly debate. Were the boundaries between sacred and profane as rigid as they appear? Some argue that church authorities tried desperately to draw sharp lines, banishing certain instruments from liturgy, condemning dances as sinful. Yet evidence suggests constant overlap. Clerics themselves wrote secular songs. Secular tunes sometimes slipped into church polyphony, a cheeky borrowing known as a contrafactum. Even moralizing sermons occasionally used body imagery to get their point across. Perhaps, then, the two realms weren't enemies at all, but intertwined threads of the same medieval tapestry. Picture a village festival in spring. The church bell announces Vespers, calling the faithful to prayer. But just beyond the churchyard wall, fiddlers tune up for the evening dance. You can almost hear the sound bleed together, solemn chant drifting one way, raucous laughter rising the other. Young men and women sneak glances at each other in the square, even as their parents cross themselves in the nave. It's a sound duel, a tug of war for the medieval soul. And yet, both sides were necessary. The sacred gave meaning, structure, eternal perspective. The profane gave release, laughter, joy, humanity. Without one, the other would collapse under its own weight. The truth is, medieval ears were accustomed to hearing both, sometimes even in the same day, the same hour, the same earshot. You sit at the edge of the square as twilight falls. From the cathedral, chant drifts outward, solemn and heavy. From the tavern, a drumbeat starts, infectious, irresistible. Soon, the two rhythms blur into one strange harmony. You realize this is the medieval condition in sound, the balance of heaven and earth, of choir stalls and ale benches, of angels and jesters, always speaking at once. The year is 1347, and the first ships arrive in Sicily, carrying more than grain, more than silk, more than trade goods. They carry a silence that will soon fall over Europe, broken only by weeping, tolling bells, and the creak of funeral carts. The Black Death spreads like a shadow across the continent, and with it comes a new kind of music. Music steeped in lament, in terror, in desperate pleas for mercy. You walk through a plague-ravaged town. The air itself feels heavy, not just with the stench of illness, but with the strange stillness of suspended life. Markets are closed, inns abandoned. Yet the soundscape isn't empty, it's reshaped. Priests chant prayers of intercession in the streets. Processions wind through alleys. with hymns rising thinly above coughs and cries. Bells toll endlessly, not for worship, but for death. So many that the very sound of a bell becomes a language of loss. Inside monasteries, monks sing the Dies Irae, the Day of Wrath. Its melody is stark, terrifying, almost like a warning siren echoing across the ages. You can imagine the chant hanging in cold stone halls, as men who've seen half their brothers buried still force their voices to carry the words. That day of wrath, that dreadful day. This isn't distant theology anymore. It feels immediate, bodily, mainstream fact. The Black Death had a profound effect on medieval music. With so much death, choirs and ensembles dwindled. Manuscripts sometimes fell unfinished as scribes succumbed. The themes of surviving compositions became darker, reflecting mortality and the fragility of life. The Dies Irae sequence, though written earlier, gained prominence as plague ravaged Europe, embedding itself deeply into the collective imagination of the late Middle Ages. Quirky detail: some survivors believed music itself could ward off the plague. Records describe musicians paid to play in public squares to sweeten the air and drive away corruption. Imagine fiddlers and pipers standing bravely as citizens scattered, their tunes fluttering uselessly against invisible death. In one German chronicle, there's even mention of townsfolk dancing in long chains to keep sickness at bay, an eerie prelude to later episodes of dancing plague. Scholarly debate: did the Black Death mark the birth of a more personal, emotional strain of music in Europe? Some scholars argue yes, that the experience of mass death shifted music from pure devotion toward expressions of raw grief and fear, paving the way for later Renaissance sensibilities. Others caution against overstating, pointing out that lament traditions existed long before. Yet it's hard to deny that the shadow of plague sharpened every note sung in its wake. Picture yourself as a child in 1350, sitting outside a shuttered house. From inside, your mother hums a lullaby, thin and cracked from exhaustion. But the lullaby has changed, less playful, more prayer than song. Across the street, a passing friar leads neighbors in chanting the Miserere, "Have mercy on me, O God." The two sounds, mother's lullaby and friar's chant, intertwine in the dusk, weaving despair and hope into the same fragile melody. The Black Death created a paradox. On one hand, it decimated choirs, broke up traditions, silenced voices. On the other, it heightened awareness of mortality, pressing music into service as consolation, memorial, and defiance. Even amid overwhelming loss, people sang. They sang to remember, to hope, to rage against silence itself. You sit under a tree at the edge of the village. The sun sets blood red, casting shadows over abandoned fields. From far away comes the toll of another bell, another death. But closer still, you hear a soft song. A group of children, half orphans, inventing their own chant, mixing prayers with nonsense rhymes. It's haunting, but strangely resilient. In their frail voices, you hear a truth that even plague can't erase, that music endures, carrying sorrow and survival alike. The plague has passed, though its echo lingers in memory and scar. Out of the silence that followed, a different sound rises, Not the tolling of bells, not the chants of fear, but something shimmering, inward, almost otherworldly. This is the age of the mystics, where visions of God and cosmic love are set to music, and voices reach beyond stone walls into realms of fire, ecstasy, and revelation. You find yourself in a candlelit room, the air heavy with the scent of beeswax and herbs. A woman sits at a table covered in parchment. Her name is Hildegard of Bingen, and though she died decades before the Black Death, her music still pulses through monastic halls like a vein of light. She writes in strange images, fiery visions of the universe, wheels of flame, rivers of living light, and her music carries that same intensity. Her chants soar higher, twist freer than the more rigid plain song of her male contemporaries. Listening, you feel less like you're walking into a church and more like you're flying into a vision. The mystics of the late Middle Ages saw song as more than ornament. It was a direct pathway to the divine. When words failed, music could transport the soul where sermons could not. Imagine closing your eyes in a cloister, voices rising around you, and suddenly you feel yourself lifted, carried, no longer earthbound, but caught in the current of something vast and unknowable. Mainstream fact, figures like Hildegard of Bingen and later mystics such as Meister Eckhart emphasized the union of human soul and divine presence, and music was central to their practice. Hildegard composed an entire Symphonia Harmonia Celestium Revelationum, a symphony of the harmony of celestial revelations, making her not only one of the first named female composers, but also one of the most radical. Her works were so distinctive that modern scholars often remark how they stand apart from typical medieval chant. Quirky detail: Hildegard believed music could heal illness. She prescribed not just herbs and diets, but also songs, specific chants meant to realign body and spirit. In her cosmology, the human soul was a kind of instrument, vibrating with the harmonies of creation. Get out of tune, and you got sick. Sing the right notes, and you might be restored. Imagine being handed not a pill, but a melody as medicine. Scholarly debate. Did Hildegard's unique voice flourish because of her gendered outsider status, or in spite of it? Some argue that being a woman gave her freedom to experiment outside rigid male monastic traditions. Others claim her visions were tolerated only because they could be framed as divinely inspired, not as personal innovation. What is clear is that her music doesn't sit quietly. It demands to be heard across centuries. But Hildegard was not alone. Across Europe, mystics and visionaries were weaving sound into their devotions. Richard Rolla, an English hermit, described a mystical experience of canor, an inner melody so intense it felt like hearing the angelic choir within his own body. Others reported hearing celestial music in trances, sometimes so sweet it left them weeping. You walk into a small chapel where nuns are gathered at midnight. Their chants are softer than Hildegard's soaring flights, but there's something piercing in the repetition, the way the tones seem to vibrate against the walls until they settle into your chest. One sister closes her eyes and rocks gently, lips barely moving, as though the song has become less performance and more heartbeat. Not all mystic music was sanctioned. Some groups wandered the edges of heresy, claiming songs revealed directly by God. Authorities often grew uneasy with these voices, especially women's voices, that bypassed clerical hierarchy. Yet even suppression could not erase the hunger for a music that broke boundaries. Picture yourself at dawn in a meadow, dew sparkling like 1,000 tiny bells. A small group of mystics, half hidden by trees, sing a hymn no one has written down. It bends and shifts like wind. They believe each note is a ladder rung, each breath an offering. Listening, you don't feel you've entered a concert. You feel you've stumbled into the very heart of longing. The mystics remind us that medieval music wasn't only stone, form, and discipline. It could also be wild, ecstatic, uncontainable. It could fling the soul out of its body and set it burning in love. And though their voices have faded into vellum manuscripts and scattered reports, you can still hear them if you listen, not with your ears, but with that part of you that knows what it is to ache, to wonder, to reach. Somewhere, across centuries, Hildegard's words still ring. The soul is symphonic. The mystics have sung their visions, filling cloisters with fire and light. But step outside those monasteries, and you enter a very different atmosphere. Not incense and vision, but ink and argument. Welcome to the medieval university, where the soundscape shifts from choirs of devotion to the scratch of quills, the murmur of disputation, and the occasional slam of a book, heavy enough to break your foot. Here, music is not just felt, it is dissected, debated, and defined. You walk through the bustling streets of Paris in the 13th century, the intellectual capital of Europe. Students in shabby cloaks argue loudly in Latin, some gesturing wildly with ink-stained hands. A few of them carry instruments, lutes, psalteries, fiddles, not for busking, but for demonstration in class. For the university, music isn't entertainment. It's one of the 7 liberal arts, grouped under the quadrivium, alongside arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. To study music here means to study ratios, proportions, and the very mathematics of harmony. Step into a lecture hall. It's colder than you'd like. The stone walls unyielding. But at the front sits a master in flowing robes. He opens a parchment to a diagram. Circles within circles. Lines crossing. Numbers marking intervals. He quotes Boethius, the 6th century Roman philosopher, whose writings formed the bedrock of medieval music theory. For Boethius, and for centuries of students after him, music was divided into 3 kinds. Musica mundana, the music of the spheres, the cosmic harmony of the universe. Musica humana, the harmony within the human body and soul. Musica instrumentalis, the music actually produced by voices and instruments. The first 2, oddly enough, were considered more important than the last. To study music was, in part, to imagine how planets sang in orbit and how veins pulsed in mathematical rhythm. Mainstream fact. By the 13th and 14th centuries, universities in Paris, Oxford, Bologna, and elsewhere institutionalized the study of music as a science. Students learned not how to perform, but how to theorize, how to measure consonance, explain dissonance, and align earthly sound with celestial order. Performance remained the domain of choirs, courts, and common folk, while the academy chased after numbers and proportions. Quirky detail. Some lectures became almost theatrical. Masters would bang monochords, one-string instruments used to demonstrate pitch ratios. Like professors today, smack the chalkboard. Students joked about how many strings it took to make their master stop lecturing. Answer: none. He'd keep going regardless. And in Paris, students were notorious for parody songs, mocking their professors, slipping bits of Latin scorn into tavern drinking tunes. Imagine defending a dissertation, only to hear your arguments remixed as the refrain of a bawdy chorus. That night in the local ale house. Scholarly debate. Did these universities liberate music by giving it intellectual weight? Or did they trap it in abstract cages? Some argue the scholastics turned music into cold mathematics, neglecting the living art of song. Others claim their precise theories laid the groundwork for later revolutions, especially when combined with the bold experimentation happening in the Notre Dame school. Without those dry lectures, perhaps polyphony itself might never have been codified or understood. Now picture a disputation, a formal debate staged before faculty and students. The topic? Whether dissonance could, under any circumstances, be considered pleasing to the ear. One master insists, no, it is corruption, a failure of proportion. Another counters, perhaps the ear delights in tension before resolution. Voices rise, quills scribble. The room buzzes with the clash of intellect. In the corner, a student stifles a yawn. He was up all night drinking and singing profane songs that break every rule being defended here. The irony is not lost. You slip out into the street. The air is alive with another kind of music. Street singers, troubadours, and bells ringing from churches across Paris. Here lies the tension of the age. In the classroom, music is measured with numbers, debated with syllogisms, folded into cosmic philosophy. Outside, it is lived, sung, played, and danced. The university does not quite know what to do with this gap. Yet, from this intellectual wrestling will emerge new tools of notation, new understandings of rhythm, and new ways to teach composition itself. In the medieval imagination, then, music becomes both mystery and math. The mystics heard it in their visions. The universities measured it with monochords. Between ecstasy and equation, the Middle Ages kept trying to pin down sound itself. And the debates echo still. Is music ultimately about feeling or about form? About divine rapture or rational order? In Paris, in Oxford, in Bologna, the arguments roll on like chants in stone halls, endless, echoing, and strangely melodic. If the universities were dissecting music with ink and ratios, the roads and ports of medieval Europe were humming with something less orderly and far more alive. Step with me now out of the lecture hall and into the dust of the open world. Music is on the move, carried by pilgrims, merchants, conquerors, captives, and dreamers. This is the Middle Ages at its most vibrant, where crossroads become concert halls, and where East meets West, not just in war and trade, but in sound. Picture the Mediterranean Sea, a restless expanse of blue, scattered with sails like white stitches on cloth. Ships creak under the weight of spices, silks, and, though less visible, melodies. A Venetian sailor hums a tune picked up in Alexandria. A Moorish merchant carries an oud, the ancestor of the lute. It's carved wood and taut strings, whispering secrets of Arabic maqam scales. A troubadour in Provence hears it, adapts it, and soon a new fashion is born. Love songs strummed on instruments that, just a century before, would have been exotic novelties. Mainstream fact: the medieval lute, one of Europe's most iconic instruments, was adapted directly from the Arabic oud, introduced through Muslim Spain and Mediterranean trade. Alongside it came rhythmic and modal innovations that deeply influenced European music. The Crusades, bloody, chaotic, and devastating, also functioned, ironically, as conduits of cultural exchange. Soldiers returned not only with scars, but with fragments of song, new instruments, and rhythms that would seep into Western traditions. Now imagine Spain under the Convivencia, where Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived in complex coexistence. In the courts of Toledo and Cordoba, poetry was sung in Hebrew, Arabic, and Castilian, sometimes on the same evening. A Jewish poet might accompany himself on the rebec, followed by a Muslim singer improvising a melismatic line, and then a Christian cleric adding a Latin hymn. Three faiths sharing a roof, if not always in peace, then at least in resonance. This blend gave birth to new repertoires, like the haunting Cantigas de Santa Maria, collected under King Alfonso X in the 13th century, where sacred devotion merged with worldly melodies. Quirky detail: not all these cultural exchanges were solemn. In Sicily, street musicians from Greece, North Africa, and Italy sometimes clashed in noisy competitions. Who could play the loudest, fastest, or most shockingly? Travelers record flutists and drummers so raucous they frightened pack animals. And in port cities, taverns often doubled as international jam sessions. Genoese sailors beating on barrels, while Arab drummers answered with darabukas, and someone inevitably pulling out a bagpipe to overwhelm them all. Scholarly debate: how deep did these influences go? Some historians argue that the Arabic modes and rhythmic cycles revolutionized European music, laying foundations for polyphony and shaping troubadour poetry. Others caution against exaggeration, noting that medieval Europe had its own strong traditions, and that not every exotic sound left a permanent trace. The truth, as usual, is likely somewhere in between. What is certain is that the Middle Ages were far less musically isolated than once imagined. Travel further east, and the connections only multiply. Along the Silk Road, instruments traveled like wandering minstrels. The Persian santur, ancestor of the hammered dulcimer, inspired European psalteries. The Chinese erhu whispered into the lineage of bowed strings. Even the bagpipe, so proudly Celtic in modern imagination, had cousins from India to North Africa, all blaring away at weddings, markets, and battlefields. You, standing at one of these medieval crossroads, can feel the swirl of it. Greek chants, Arabic improvisations, Jewish psalms, Norse fiddling, French trouvère ballads, all colliding, clashing, and sometimes harmonizing. The air is thick with dust, spices, and the sound of strangers trying to turn each other's music into their own. By night, you find yourself in a caravanserai, where merchants rest their weary animals and share food around a fire. Someone begins to play a slow, winding melody on a reed flute. Another answers on a fiddle, uncertain at first, then more confident. Soon, a drum joins in, and a song in a language you don't know, but recognize all the same, because rhythm and tone need no translation. This is the crossroads at its purest. Not a theory, not a lecture, but the moment where cultures meet, and music bridges the silence between them. In this tangled web of influences, medieval music stopped being local and started being global, long before anyone had the word for it. The 14th and 15th centuries sit like a hinge in musical history, a creaking, golden door slowly opening onto the wide hall of the Renaissance. If you follow the winding pilgrim roads, the echoing cloisters, and the noisy fairs, you can feel it already. The Middle Ages have run their course, and something new is stirring in the air. This isn't just about sound anymore. It's about the way people think, write, and imagine music itself. The old world of chants, troubadours, and guild musicians doesn't vanish, but it's about to be remade. Close your eyes. Imagine standing in Florence, circa 1400. The air is thick with the smell of parchment, fresh plaster, and maybe roasted chestnuts from a street vendor. Above you, scaffolds clatter as masons and painters labor on cathedrals and palaces. Humanism is the new talk of the town. Books are being copied, Greek texts rediscovered, and artists whisper about proportion and perspective as if they were holy relics. And here's the thing, music is swept up in the same tide. Mainstream fact, the Ars Nova movement in the 14th century, championed by figures like Guillaume de Machaut, introduced rhythmic complexity and notational precision that allowed composers to think beyond chant-based structures. By the early 15th century, a distinctly new style was taking shape. Clearer harmonies, smoother melodic lines, and an almost sculptural sense of sound that paralleled the perspective-driven art of Brunelleschi and Masaccio. Quirky detail. Musicians were not always lofty scholars. Some were hustlers. In Burgundy, court records show payments, not just for performances, but for silencing musicians when nobles wanted peace at dinner. And in Italy, wandering singers sometimes worked as human jukeboxes, memorizing the latest French polyphonic songs and offering them up in taverns for a coin. Imagine a guy in ragged hose belting a motet in Latin, while the crowd just wants him to hurry so they can get back to drinking. But let's turn to the courts, the laboratories of the coming Renaissance. In Burgundy, the dukes assembled one of the most glittering chapels in Europe. Composers like Guillaume Dufay and Gilles Banchois became celebrities of their day, their music spreading by manuscript across the continent. Dufay's masses combined technical mastery with a new warmth of sound, melodies borrowed from popular songs, chords that rang sweet instead of harsh, and structures that felt as much like architecture as like prayer. Scholarly debate. Was this truly the Renaissance in music? Or just the late flowering of the Middle Ages? Some argue that the Renaissance label is an artificial borrowing from art history, that musically, the 15th century is still medieval in spirit, with its reliance on church patronage and complex notation. Others insist that the use of triadic harmony, the major, minor chords, we hear as natural today, and the international style, forged by composers moving between Italy, France, and the Low Countries, mark a decisive break. Either way, you can hear the shift. Music was becoming less about lines in motion and more about vertical sonorities, about harmony itself. Travel now to England, where composers like John Dunstable were experimenting with what contemporaries called the Continence Angloise, the English sound. Imagine chords blooming like stained glass light, smooth intervals of thirds and sixths washing over listeners, used to harsher medieval textures. This English sweetness profoundly influenced continental masters, carried across the channel with traveling choirs and scribbled manuscripts. Suddenly, everyone wanted a taste of that gentle consonance. Meanwhile, new technology was looming. Johannes Gutenberg's press was about to transform the way knowledge traveled. For centuries, music had moved at the speed of parchment, slowly, expensively, by hand. But as the 15th century closed, printed music would emerge, making songs, motets, and treatises more accessible than ever. For the first time, a young musician might learn the latest style, not by traveling hundreds of miles, but by buying a book. Picture it, a choir singing in a freshly built chapel, their voices weaving in rich, consonant textures. Outside, street performers still crank hurdy-gurdies and bang on drums, carrying echoes of the Middle Ages. But inside the court and cathedral walls, the sound is undeniably new. Balanced, polished, almost sculpted. It feels like standing at the threshold of a brighter room, one foot still in shadow, the other stepping into Renaissance light. And you, sitting quietly at the edge of the choir, can hear both worlds, the raw medieval past, the emerging Renaissance future, braided together in harmony. Picture the end of a long day in a medieval town, the kind where sound never really leaves. It just bounces off stone walls and wooden beams until it drifts into silence. Music in the Middle Ages was like that too. Its echo doesn't vanish when we say Renaissance begins. Instead, it lingers, folded into every note that comes after. Tonight, we're going to sit with that echo, let it fade forward, and feel how the Middle Ages left fingerprints on everything that followed. Close your eyes. Imagine a monk humming plain chant in a dim cloister. The tone is steady, timeless, like a thread woven through centuries. That chant, the backbone of medieval worship, didn't disappear with the 15th century. Renaissance composers like Josquin des Prez still borrowed it, built towering motets around it, and let it glide like an ancient river beneath new harmonies. The echo of chant carried forward, reshaped, but never lost. Now, tilt your ear toward the marketplace. Remember the fiddlers, drummers, and hurdy-gurdy players at the fair? Their rhythms and dances slipped into courtly music, then into printed books. Even the Renaissance pavane and galliard, the elegant court dances, owe a little debt to those stomping feet in muddy squares. The raw joy of medieval street music never left. It just put on finer clothes. Mainstream fact: the so-called Renaissance didn't erase the Middle Ages, but absorbed them. Polyphony, notation systems, and even instruments were medieval inventions that blossomed into new forms. Without the experiments of Notre Dame composers or the rhythmic innovations of Ars Nova, there would be no Renaissance polychoral splendor in Venice, no sweeping masses by Palestrina. The medieval period is less a prologue than a foundation stone. Quirky detail. Did you know that some medieval instruments literally survived into later eras by changing shape and name? The shawm grew into the oboe. The bombard transformed into the bassoon. The fiddle, well, it stretched and slimmed and refined itself until it became the violin. The Middle Ages didn't vanish from the orchestra pit. They're still singing right there, in wood and gut strings. And here's where the scholarly debate hums. Was the Renaissance a rupture? Or was it continuity disguised as novelty? Some musicologists argue that we overemphasize rebirth, when really the line between 1400 and 1500 is blurred. Others insist that the shift in harmony and aesthetic, from music as divine geometry to music as expressive art, was seismic. The truth, like a chord made of consonance and dissonance, lies somewhere between. But tonight, you don't need to decide. Just listen. Hear how the echoes stretch forward. A troubadour's melody, once sung under starlight to a noble lady, finds its way into a Renaissance madrigal, playful and witty. A monk's chant becomes the cantus firmus of a grand polyphonic mass. A village dance tune is polished into a courtly suite. These echoes don't die. They ripple, transform, and whisper to new generations. Now, imagine the printing press rolling out pages of music. For the first time, sound could travel faster than footsteps, farther than memory. Those medieval echoes, pressed in ink, leapt across borders, whispering to Italy, Germany, France, England, building bridges of melody where walls of politics stood. And as the Renaissance dawns, the Middle Ages lean back, their music not vanishing, but settling into a hum beneath the surface, like a lullaby you half remember from childhood. So here we are, at the end of the journey. You've walked the cloisters, trudged the pilgrim roads, sat in cathedrals, laughed at fairs, and listened to voices, both sacred and profane. Every sound you've met is part of the great echo, fading, yes, but always forward. As you drift towards sleep, let that echo wrap around you. Hear the chant, the lute, the fiddle, the organ, all blending into one long breath of history. The Middle Ages may have closed their chapter, but their music is still humming, quietly, inside every note you've ever heard since. Softly, slowly, the echo fades. Forward. You've wandered through centuries tonight, from stone cloisters to bustling fairs, from chants that rose like incense to fiddles stamping out joy in muddy squares. And now, as the echoes settle, it's time to let go of history's noise and rest in its silence. Take a slow, deep breath. Imagine you're lying on cool grass outside a cathedral after the bells have stopped. The walls are quiet now, but you can almost feel the music still shimmering in the air, as though the stones themselves remember. Inhale again and picture the calm glow of candlelight, flickering steadily but without urgency. Every sound you've carried, the chanting monks, the troubadour's lute, the laughter of festival crowds, has softened into a single gentle hum. Your body is heavy, grounded like an anchor, sinking into calm waters. Your mind, though, is light, drifting like a feather, following that hum as it fades into silence. Even the busiest medieval street, even the grandest cathedral choir, always ended in rest. So too, your night draws to its still point. Let your shoulders sink. Let your thoughts drift further away. The echo of the Middle Ages, of devotion, of joy, of sorrow, is now only a whisper, carrying you toward dreams. You don't need to hold on the details or dates, just a feeling of time's great river moving steadily forward. You are safe, afloat, and part of the same long story. Sleep comes like a hush at the end of a hymn, closing softly, naturally. Let it gather around you now. The echo fades, and you fade gently, too. Rest well. The music continues tomorrow, but for now, only silence. Sweet dreams.